afternoon and welcome everyone to the November 12th Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. Due to the distance and health and safety concerns, members of the public are not in attendance at this meeting, but full access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication, allowing members of the public without cost to listen using teleconference as available. The agenda for this meeting has been posted on the Public Square website and may be requested from the governor's office by emailing Don Knutston at don.knutston@ks.gov. Each member of the commission and staff will state their name and title each time the individual begins speaking or voting so the individual can be readily identified by remote listeners. All participants are required to ensure that microphones or phones or electronic devices are muted when the participants are not speaking, so the ability of the remote listeners or observers to hear the proceedings is not unnecessarily impeded. Public comment will not be allowed at this meeting. During this meeting, the commission will not recess to a closed or executive session pursuant to KSA 754319. Each motion, if any, will be clearly stated before the committee and the chairperson will announce the results of the final vote. I'm Dr. Anderson, the co-chair and the superintendent of Topeka Public Schools. And again, good evening. As we prepare to start, I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Dr. Portillo, who will remind us all of the structure and what we look forward to accomplishing today.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. As Dr. Anderson mentioned, I'm Dr. Shannon Portillo, co-chair of the commission and associate dean at the University of Kansas Edwards campus. So today we have a short agenda that's packed full of a lot of items. Our main focus is going to be finishing up the recommendations for our reports. So we're going to take the bulk of our time from now until about 4:15 to focus on report recommendations and report outs from some of our more recent learning sessions. Just as a reminder, I want to go over the process that we'll walk through before we dig into the actual substance of the report. So we sent out a draft report to all commissioners, and that report had green items for a consent agenda, yellow items that we're still needing to talk through and vote on, and then some blue items that could use a bit more discussion. So we'd like to start our meeting today by going over the consent agenda. If there are any items that anyone would like to pull off of the consent agenda, please just let us know and we'll move those for more discussion. We'll then vote on that consent agenda. When we do a vote, just because we are conducting this over Zoom, if everyone could please state their name and then vote. We'll then move on to those yellow items. Those yellow items are ones where we've had some initial discussion and we've completed our learning sessions around those items. We will move forward with discussion and hopefully come to consensus as we have with a number of other items previously. But if we don't come to consensus, Dr. Anderson or I will ask for us to have a vote. When we vote a simple majority, we'll move something into the recommendation category. If we do need to have a bit more discussion, we may table it, but know that next week's meeting is our last before we have to turn over our report. So that will be when we complete all of our recommendations for our final report. At 4:15, we'll turn to a discussion of a communications plan for how we will actually roll out our report and make sure that everyone knows about all the good work that we've been doing in this past few months. Any questions about process before we move forward? Okay,
this is co-chair.
Please go ahead, Dr. Anderson.
This is co-chair Dr. Anderson. So not seeing any questions, we're going to pull up the timeline to remind everyone the timeline from now until the report is final as to the next steps. As we share the screen and pull up these final meetings. As a reminder, this final report, as that screen comes up, is due on December the 1st. And so as we have that December the 1st meeting, our very next meeting will be next week. During that time, as has been stated, we'll use that to finalize any remaining items and take any remaining votes that don't get taken today. With that just brief overview of that timeline, we're going to jump right on into the content of our learning sessions. We'll pull up the timeline just for those that are watching very briefly. As a reminder, we started on October 28th, November the 10th, the full draft report. November 10th, the full report draft was sent to us, which is where we are today. On the 18th, those final edits will be made, and the November 25th timeframe, that final report draft will be sent to all of us in preparation for December the 1st.
This is co-chair Dr. Portillo. We'll now ask Kate to please pull up the consent agenda. So we had two main items on that consent agenda. We hope that all commissioners had a chance to look at that before our meeting today. Would anyone like to pull any item off of the consent agenda for additional discussion? Again, these two items were the focus on law enforcement training that had a number of bullet points underneath it, and then tribal jurisdiction. It looks like we do not have anyone wishing to remove anything from the consent agenda, so we will go ahead and vote on the consent agenda. So I will call folks out just in the order that they are on my screen, and if we could just vote to approve or not the consent agenda. And again, this is Shannon Portillo, co-chair, and I vote to approve our consent agenda. Dr. Anderson?
Yes.
Commissioner Mark McCormick?
Commissioner Mark McCormick from the ACLU of Kansas, I vote yes.
Commissioner Gordon Ramsey?
Yes.
Commissioner David Jordan?
Yes.
Commissioner Jackson Winsett?
Approve.
Commissioner John Nave?
Yeah.
Commissioner
Yes.
Centeno?
I also approve.
Commissioner Brandon Davis?
I approve.
Commissioner Catalina Valerde?
Aye.
Commissioner Nestor de la Rosa?
I approve.
Thank you. And I see that we have two phone numbers on here. I don't know if those are additional commissioners.
This is Secretary D'Angela Burns Wallace, State of Kansas. I am one of those numbers, and I do vote to approve.
Thank you.
And this is Commissioner David Jordan, and one of the phone numbers is mine.
Thank you. Okay, so our consent agenda, again, this is Shannon Portillo, co-chair. Our consent agenda is now approved, so all of those green items will be added to our final report. We will move now to the yellow items on our report, and we'll start with the first set of items, and this is one that we've had quite a bit of discussion around, our immigration and law enforcement items. There are two bullet points here. The first says, adopt a clear and transparent policy on how, if at all, local law enforcement, counties, cities, and others will treat immigration enforcement efforts, including providing resources and assistance to ICE. We will provide some policy examples in the appendix. The second, in order to maintain law enforcement focus on their primary duties, law enforcement agency collaboration with federal partners should not duplicate the work of those federal partners. We'll open up this area to discussion.
This is Commissioner Velarde. I like the language and the bullet points as stated. I know that there has been significant discussion as to, what a policy of cooperation or non-cooperation would look like, but I believe that these bullet points express that there is still work to be done in that area. So that is something that can be ongoing.
Thank you. These are areas that we've discussed before, so if we don't have further discussion, shall we take a vote on these two items as well? Okay, it looks like,
Chair Portillo, this is Mark McCormick from the ACLU of Kansas. Something occurred to me looking at this list again and having attended the meeting yesterday with the Fraternal Order of Police. I can't remember how it came up, but looking at the bullet that says recruitment, retention, and promotion, it occurred to me that we might want to add a line encouraging police departments to have command structures that reflect the communities that they serve.
this is co-chair Dr. Portillo. I do appreciate that addition. So it sounds like we're ready to move on to our discussion of recruitment, retention, and promotion, do we have consensus on moving the immigration and law enforcement bullet point to our final report? Hearing no objection, we'll move forward. Okay, so let's continue with the discussion of recruitment, retention, and promotion. And just for those of us who are on the phone, I'll go ahead and read out the bullet points that are currently under that. The first is incentivize promotion and retention of traditionally underrepresented groups. The second is explore options around increasing officer pay. The third is salary enhancements tied to degree attainment for law enforcement officers. And the fourth is encourage police departments to have a command structure that reflect the communities they serve. We'll open this section up to further discussion.
The word, this is Gordon Ramsey from Wichita. Quick question on kind of the intent on incentivize. Is that encourage, coach and mentor? What's the background behind that term? My question, specifically, it's not, I think that could use a little clarification. For me, it would be helpful.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. That's a great question, because when I see the word incentivize, I wonder what the incentive is that we're actually, and where that incentive may come from. So I wonder if we might change incentivize to encourage the promotion and retention of traditionally underrepresented groups, since we don't currently have any incentives to hand out.
I would agree with that. This is Gordon Ramsey from Wichita. Thank you.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. One item that I thought we talked about, although I don't see it here unless it's somewhere else, didn't we talk about, well, I guess we do have underrepresented groups, but we talked about our Hispanic population and perhaps some level of retention recruitment, but I guess that really covers that in a broad sense, unless others think that it needs to be specifically mentioned in this area.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo, and we actually, I think that it's being pulled up here. We do have we have already approved changing the state statute that focuses on recruitment and hiring to be more inclusive and reflect military expectations rather than a citizenship requirement. Are there any other comments for this section, or do we have consensus to approve?
If I may, Dr. Portillo, as I look at the items that have already been approved on this topic, if the commission would kind of give staff some latitude to maybe combine some of these items, making sure that all of them are included in the final report. But I think there are a number of things that kind of speak to this diversity conversation that maybe don't need to all be separate bullet points. So if the commission doesn't mind approving it with the understanding that staff may do a little work on the language to make sure everything's included, but maybe not separate items.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. For me, that will be helpful. Do we see, if you disagree, please indicate that now. Otherwise, we'll proceed accordingly. Thank you.
Okay, and we will now move, this is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. We'll now move on to officer certification and standards. Under this section, we have 2 bullet points as well. The first says, require that an officer fired in one municipality for egregious offense as provided in KSA 74-5616 cannot be hired in a different municipality. The municipality may choose to hire an officer fired from another municipality for minor offenses not included in the statute as deemed appropriate by the hiring entity. The second bullet point, law enforcement agencies should be required to check an officer's record with CPOST before making a hiring decision. We'll open this section up to conversation.
This is Commissioner Velarde. Sorry. So should we change cannot be hired by another municipality to cannot be hired by another law enforcement agency, because there are certainly law enforcement agencies that are not municipality tied. Thank you.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. Yes, and we've updated that in the language. Thank you. Commissioner McCormick?
This is Commissioner McCormick. My question would be about the word minor and what might constitute minor.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. As I read this bullet point, I see minor as anything that is currently not covered by the state statute and at the discretion of the hiring agency. If we want to provide more guidance than that, I think we need to be more specific, but that's how I would interpret this current recommendation.
This is Judge Centeno in Sedgwick County. Can we just say that, replace minor offenses with what you just said?
So anything not covered by the statute up to this discretion of the hiring agency?
Yes.
Yes. Commissioner Ramsey, were you going to jump in?
Thank you. This is Gordon Ramsey from Wichita. I also thought at the second bullet, there is significant work to create a national database. Matter of fact, I read an article that one may even already exist, but I think we should add in there that if and when a national database comes into existence, that should be part of the background check as well. Something similar to that.
This is Co-Chair Portillo. I appreciate that addition.
This is John Nave with the Kansas AFL-CIO. On that second bullet point, that word should be, would it be better to say must be required, or where it should be seems like there's a question behind it? I don't know.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I think that part of why we have should be in there is that we as a commission are making recommendations, so we cannot actually require anything of agencies, though I think we could say, yes, recommend law enforcement agencies be required, to make it clear that our intent is that that should happen.
Okay.
Any additional conversation on these two bullet points? Since we have updated the language, I'll go ahead and read these both out loud for those commissioners who are joining us by phone, and then we can see if we have consensus or need a vote. So the first bullet point now reads, require that an officer fired in one law enforcement agency for egregious offenses as provided in KSA 74-5616 cannot be hired in a different law enforcement agency. Municipality may choose to hire an officer fired from another law enforcement agency for offenses not included in the statute as deemed appropriate and at the discretion of the hiring entity. The second bullet point now says, recommend law enforcement agencies be required to check an officer's record with CPOST before making a hiring decision. Additionally, if and when a national database is created, law enforcement agencies should also be required to check that national database. Any objections to these two bullet points moving forward into the report? Fantastic. We'll move forward to community engagement. Community engagement has one bullet point that reads, require uniform labeling of patrol cars so that any law enforcement vehicles that are not functioning as undercover vehicles are clearly identifiable to the public. We'll open this up for discussion.
It's Gordon Ramsey from Wichita. Can someone give the context in which that was provided, put on here? I don't remember that discussion.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo again, and I don't remember the complete context, but I believe this came from one of our learning sessions when members of the public mentioned that there are some law enforcement vehicles that the the paint color is the same as the vehicle color, so it's often hard to identify them as law enforcement vehicles. And it creates a sense of intimidation in the community rather than clear labeling or clear marking of the law enforcement vehicle.
This is for Nestor De La Rosa, City of Dodge City. I participated in that listening session, and having experienced that myself with some of the neighboring counties or sheriff's departments, you often see vehicles that have the minimal, hard to distinguish labels or to be identified as law enforcement. And that creates not only the community distrust, but rather, the question of, is this legitimate, a legitimate law enforcement vehicle or not? And the other part really comes into question is, if you're not clearly identified, what is the goal really with not labeling the vehicle correctly?
This is Gordon Ramsey from Wichita. This concerns me a little bit. I drive an unmarked car, as do, we have probably 5% of our fleet is unmarked for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's used for investigative purposes. Sometimes it's used for traffic enforcement. And I understand the concern about that was brought up, but I think this is, I don't know if I could support saying that we cannot have unmarked vehicles. It's an important option for police departments as we work to investigate crime and as well as traffic enforcement.
This is for Nestor De La Rosa. I don't disagree with you, and perhaps we could do exemptions to this language. I certainly understand the role of, for example, detectives, where those should be under those circumstances unmarked. But I wonder if adding exemptions to this language would suffice.
Well, this is Jackson Wentz at Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank. Quick question though, Chief Ramsey, is there a reason, aside from undercover work, is there a reason why you would drive an unmarked vehicle when doing police business?
In cases of traffic enforcement, yes. Obviously, marked cars stick out more, and it's harder to address traffic complaints. And I can tell you that in most communities, traffic-related complaints are the #1 issue that police departments face. Just a suggestion for people to consider, maybe rather than saying require, maybe use language that identifies the concern that some communities have about unmarked cars and what that means to certain communities, and that should be considered in the percentage of unmarked cars that an organization has. I think for me, that's a lot more palatable, and it also provides that context that I think is important for many in policing to understand how certain people feel about it and how that impacts them, versus requiring certain labeling for cars. I think that's a really it could just be problematic for many organizations, many law enforcement organizations.
This co-chair, Dr. Anderson, would it perhaps be appropriate if we said something such as when possible, or in appropriate situations, or encourage? Would any of those words be palatable to the members that would like for the statement to remain?
This is co-chair Dr. Portillo. I guess I'm a bit concerned that traffic enforcement is one of those pieces that Commissioner Ramsey brought up, because I think part of the concern we heard from the learning sessions was actually when an unmarked vehicle or a minimally marked vehicle goes after someone for traffic enforcement, it can be a very intimidating experience for residents because they're unsure whether that is an actual law enforcement officer. And so it creates a sense of intimidation and a disconnect between the community and those who are meant to protect and serve. And so it's actually those traffic enforcement pieces where I think the main concern was brought up, whether someone's actually being pulled over by a law enforcement officer or not. So I hear that there are other, I think around detectives, undercover work, there are other times when someone may not need to see that clear labeling, but it seems like traffic enforcement is actually one of those times when it would be useful to community members.
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. It sounds to me that we may want to consider moving this again. I see both sides of this thing as when I'm doing work here in my office, I drive an unmarked car, but I don't pull vehicles over. However, I still don't want people to be able to see me in the community because many of them may want to harm me, sadly. And so I think there's a lot of safety concerning the officers that we're really not taking into consideration, not just the detectives, but we're dealing with brass and we're dealing with others. And though there are officers whose main job is patrol in traffic, there are others who may have to make a traffic stop who's not a part of that unit. And so I think the conversation can be more so of what unifying or public notification can officers give on their vehicles, even if it's at the point of stop, versus saying that there can't be any unmarked cars. And so I just think there's a lot more discussion that we probably should take in consideration than pushing this one through.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. I agree. If this stays for the next time, for either next week, and if in fact District Attorney Dupree or Chief Ramsey or others may even offer some language in advance, that might give us a greater opportunity to look at that in a way that feels good on both ends and takes into account things that we might not be as aware of.
And this is Commissioner David Jordan. I just had a clarifying question. In the past, I feel like I've lived in a state that required all traffic patrol law enforcement to be in an identified police car. So I just wonder if other states have the standard that there's a clear requirement for traffic patrol to be clearly identified. I think that might be helpful to know.
This is Co-Chair Dr. I was going to say, Dr. Portillo, it sounds like we're ready to go on to the next item. I'll turn it back on over to you.
Great, thank you. So our next item is accountability. We have quite a few bullet points under this item. The first is data collected related to law enforcement recruiting, promotion, pullovers, and use of force should be clear and readily available to members of the public. The second is identify a state agency or Regent University to analyze all pullover data and use of force and racial bias complaint data to identify trends and make an annual report available publicly. Third, review and revise policies and training on use of force to authorize only the minimal amount of force necessary to protect citizens and officer safety that is proportional to the incident, that brings unlawful situations safely and effectively under control, and that prevents the constitutional and human rights, that preserves the constitutional and human rights of the citizen. Fourth, the legislature should review the racial and bias-based policing policies that were updated in statute in 2011 and determine if they are serving the intended purpose. Specifically, the legislature should address 1, the process for filing a complaint of racial or bias-based policing or other complaints related to law enforcement, such as use of force complaints, to ensure the process is clear and accessible to Kansans. 2, what entity is most appropriate to manage the process of filing those complaints, conducting an independent and thorough investigation, and ensuring accountability measures as appropriate. And 3, the availability of data related to such complaints and responsive action taken. We will open up the discussion for our accountability items.
This is Commissioner McCormick. I have a question for you, Co-Chair Portillo. Does data collection include information that could be obtained from, say, dash cam footage or body cam footage?
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. So we actually don't have discussions of dash cam or body cam footage in either the accountability section or the data collection section right now, but the commission was sent a memo on body cams this week. And so we could create an additional recommendations around body cam and dash cam footage, but it's not currently included in these sections.
This is Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. When it comes to the data collection process, something like dash cams or body cams will only be necessary if there was an incident. I think the data collection, generally speaking, is data from pullovers, data from use of force, which may include, if the use of force someone had body cam or dash cam, that may be utilized in like investigatory purposes. But this is for, I think, data collection to be analyzed to look at patterns of discrimination or patterns of misbehavior.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. It sounds like we don't have much additional conversation on the accountability bullet points, though we may ask for an additional bullet point around dash cam and body cam footage to be discussed next week. Is that where we're at as a commission? Okay, we will move the accountability bullet points up to the approved section. And we will focus on our data collection bullet points. Okay, data collection. This is where we actually have the most bullet points. So please bear with me as I read through all of these for us, though I think that almost all of our commissioners are here on screen now, but we'll go through these again. KLATC should collect recruitment data from all agencies and maintain a publicly available database of new recruit demographics, including race, ethnicity, and gender. KLATC should collect retention and promotion data for the state and maintain a publicly available database of current police officer demographics, including race, ethnicity, and gender. These data should be collected when KLATC certifies annual training requirements. Third, funding should be allocated for the collection of pullover data from all law enforcement agencies within the state. Funding would specifically support the development of a web-based data collection portal, so smaller agencies would not have to invest in new data collection software. North Carolina has been collecting this data since 1999 and is a potential model. Fourth, a state agency should be identified to collect and analyze pullover data. Fifth, pursuant to all pullovers, law enforcement officers should collect, and Kate, may I ask you to just scroll down a bit for me, please? Okay, the initial purpose of the traffic stop, checkpoint, stoplight, sign violation, driving while impaired, safe movement violation, etc. Vehicle driver information, including age, race, sex, ethnicity, enforcement action taken as a result of the traffic stop, physical resistance encountered, whether the vehicle driver or passenger were searched, the type of search, the basis of a search, whether the person's vehicle was searched, and identify the race and ethnicity of each passenger searched, whether any contraband was found, and whether any property was seized. So we will open up the discussion of data collection.
This is Gordon Ramsey. So this is a lot of the recommendations in here. This is a very robust. I can certainly understand how this data would be valuable. There's so many variables though on collecting it, a database. We collect most of this stuff now. It's centralized in our record system. Some issues around asking someone their race, after being in policing almost 28 years now, it's an awkward and uncomfortable question to ask, and it can make matters worse sometimes. I believe that this would be good data for us to have, but I really think we should look at maybe recommending almost some kind of another committee to explore expanding data collection in the state, to look at best practices, utilize subject matter experts, examine the costs and the needs to put together a comprehensive data collection system, rather than just kind of throwing this out there. I think that it needs, because this is a heavy lift, and how that's done, to put it on a KLETC, I don't think would be appropriate, but to put some kind of working group together to make recommendations based on best practices, input from the subject matter experts, I think would be beneficial.
So this is co-chair Dr. Portillo, and I do think that we need to kind of separate out these different data collection pieces. So the KLETC pieces are specifically around recruitment and retention numbers, and that's focused on the fact that KLETC does all of the training and oversees the other academies in the state, and that they also certify all of the annual training expectations. So that gives them 2 points of contact when folks are first recruited, and then annually to gather data around recruitment and retention. So that's one piece for KLETC. The other piece around pullover data, that is actually based off of model legislation from North Carolina and similar model legislation from the state of California, though it was a North Carolina model that was used here. So I do hear you that it's quite a few variables, though it's based on some best practices that are already happening out there. I think the funding and implementation piece will be a big lift, though I'm concerned that if we put this off and say that we need another committee to look at this, we'll have discounted the work of folks working around data collection on our commission and kind of kick the can down the road a bit for when we might actually get these data. I do think implementation, which is always the biggest issue when it comes to recommendations, will be a difficult uphill battle because this will require some funding. And this is where we'll need to do some kind of concentrated work with the legislature to think about how we might fund this. Though I'm concerned that if we say another commission or committee, that will just replicate the work that we've already pulled from considering best practices from other states.
Co-chair Dr. Anderson, my apologies, sir. Go right on ahead.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Brandon Davies, University of Kansas. I just wanted to say that this is, like Dr. Portillo was saying, this is based off of traffic stops they do in North Carolina. So what would happen is you would pull somebody over and you get their ID and then you fill it out. You only have to fill it out for the driver unless you pull somebody else out the car. So if you pull the car over with a bunch of people in the car, you don't have to fill out any information on the passengers, just the person that you pulled over. However, if you're going to pull out a passenger and search a passenger, then you have to fill out their information. And the hopes would be that you would also have their ID. So it wouldn't be like the police officer, understandably so, having to ask people on the back of the car, what color are they, or something like that.
This is co-chair Dr. Anderson. As one option, if there is a lack of comfort in approving all this at once, since it is quite robust, I think many of these bullets we can all agree on can certainly move forward. And if there are one or two bullets, for example, whether it's KLETC or the appropriate agency, there might be some language adjustments in some of those bullets. So if it is perhaps another step just to go through the 4 bullets and see if there's agreement on that, and those we can definitely move to green. Dr. Portillo, are you comfortable with that?
This is yes, I think we should take the 2 KLETC bullets first and consider those and see if there's consensus around those 2 pieces, and then go to the next 2 around pullover stops. So is there any additional discussion on the KLETC bullets?
This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair, in follow-up to Chief Ramsey's comment about KLETC, or them being the collection agency, or it adding, or it being something redundant. Would it be appropriate to say KLETC or the appropriate agency. Would that be appropriate at all, Dr. Portillo? And perhaps it's not, but is that something that might be added language just to make sure somebody does it?
So this is Dr. Portillo, co-chair. Part of why we put KLETC there is because they have these regular points of contact with all officers in the state. First, they're the ones doing the certification of all training, and then they're the ones doing the annual certification. So we thought they would be an appropriate agency to consider those retention numbers. However, I think it would be fine to say KLETC or an additional agency, as long as it's clear that there must be an agency that completes this.
So then this is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. I would encourage that the appropriate agency to ensure that unless KLTC has agreed fully, that we make sure someone, and that we're making the statement that it should be done as the clear statement. So with that being said, unless is there anyone that has a concern about those two items based on the revised language before proceeding on to the next item?
This is Gordon Ramsey. I'm not so sure. I think it might be CPOST that collects that data. So it may be good just to leave the appropriate state agency in there. Oh, you got it. Okay, I see it now. Thank you.
Seeing no other comment about questions on the two KLETC items, it looks like there is consensus. Dr. Corteo, I'll turn it back over to you for the remaining few items to get consensus.
Okay, so these remaining items, this is Dr. Portillo, co-chair. These remaining items all focus on the data collection around pullover data. Again, these were focused on looking at best practices across the country and using the North Carolina model. The first bullet point really focuses on funding this and ensuring that smaller agencies would have access to a web-based portal, which is similar to what happens in both North Carolina and California, since we have some smaller agencies that don't have their own data collection systems. And then the second bullet point focuses on actually collecting and analyzing those data. And the third bullet point lists all of the variables of those data. So we will open it up to the pullover data discussion.
This is David Jordan from the United Methodist Health Ministry Fund. I think this is a great recommendation to try to collect this data. Do we have a sense from North Carolina or the pilot project in California about how the funding worked in those states?
This is co-chair Dr. Portillo. So for the California model, that went through the Attorney General's office, and the Attorney General then, the legislature funded through the Attorney General's office, and the Attorney General created the web-based portal and worked with agencies on collecting this information. I'm not quite sure about the North Carolina model. I know Dr. Davis may have more information on that one.
Brandon Davies, University of Kansas. That's exactly how the North Carolina is too. They created through statute for the creation of a data collection agency within the Attorney General's office.
Great. And I guess one more question: do we know of any communities in Kansas that are collecting similar data that may be helpful? I know that Douglas County has some pilot project collecting data related to pedestrian traffic stops that may follow this as well. It just seems like there's good evidence and success in other states and maybe even in Kansas. So it may be something that, you know, to the previous comments, that we could move forward with today versus studying further.
This is Dr. Portillo, co-chair. So with the Douglas County study, that's a research study that's actually being funded through the city and county through the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. So that will be a research study that they will then analyze those data. They've hired consultants to do that work out of, I believe, Northeastern University. So it's kind of a one-time snapshot. What most other states that have really tried to implement this have done and really tried to make it a part of ongoing work is the North Carolina and California model, where it becomes embedded within a state agency. So it's an ongoing process. So I think that there are two different kind of aims there. And I think that the local study here in Douglas County will provide us some really great initial data but this particular proposal allows data collection to become embedded in an ongoing manner, which is kind of taking that to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just addressing this at a systems level versus a costly community by community approach.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So do we have consensus to move these 3 bullet points forward? Seeing no objections, we'll move these 3 to the final report and move on to our next section, which I can't quite see yet because these are all very lengthy bullet points. Okay, our next section is the justice system. We have 2 bullet points here. The first, adopt recommendations from the 2019 Kansas Criminal Justice Reform Commission report related to driver's license suspensions and court fines and fees. Within this, the Kansas Department of Revenue Form DC 1020 and fees associated with restricted licenses should be revised such that the fee is not paid before the person knows if they qualify for a restricted license. Second, the mandatory 90-day suspension period that accompanies reinstatement should be amended. Third, one reinstatement fee should be permitted per suspended license case number. Fourth, court should be permitted to waive mandatory fines and fees for indigent persons charged with traffic infractions. The second bullet point, adopt recommendations from the Pretrial Justice Reform Task Force related to bail, bond, and other pretrial justice issues. Both of these bullet points are ones where there's been significant work by other commissions and committees throughout our state. So we're looking to some of the work that has already been out there and trying to adopt it within our own report here. So any discussion, I guess these are 2 very different bullet points. We might take them one at a time. So let's focus first on that first bullet point around fines and fees related to driver's license suspensions. Any discussion here?
This is Judge Centeno in Sedgwick County. What I'm wondering is the second bullet point that says mandatory 90-day suspension period that accompanies reinstatement should be amended. Do we have a recommendation as to what it should be amended to?
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. That is a fantastic question that we might throw to Kate Davis.
Yeah, this is Kate Davis with the governor's office. I pulled this directly from the Criminal Justice Reform Commission report. I believe that in the legislation that was submitted, I want to say that it's after you pay your reinstatement fee and submit it, that there is a mandatory 90 days before it can be fully reinstated. I believe that there may need to be some processing time so that reinstatement can't necessarily happen immediately. I believe that the legislation actually removed the mandatory suspension period. So it's a good question. I'm not sure why it says amended instead of removed. And I can go back to that report and try and get some more detail and jog my memory on why that is. But like I said, this language I pulled directly from the 2019 Criminal Justice Reform Commission report.
This is Co-Chair Portillo. Dr. Portillo, thank you, Kate. Any additional conversation around this item?
This is Gordon Ramsey. Just a quick comment on that. So one of my questions is we also have to balance victims or that are involved. Say someone doesn't have insurance and they get a ticket for it and they lose their license. And and I agree, the license issue needs to be fixed. But what we have to keep in mind is that reckless driving is a significant issue in our communities, and somehow we want to change driving behavior, and sanctions are part of that. And what I've tried to and have had discussions about over the years is how do we balance, keeping people that need a driver's license for work and driving behavior and conduct or dangerous driving behavior, and how do we balance all that with allowing people to keep their license yet changing the reason they had the contact in the first place, changing that behavior for the, or DUI or whatever. And these are broad recommendations, but there are those considerations that I think are not in here about, you know, how do we keep the dangerous driver off the roads? There's some people that really probably shouldn't have a driver's license because of the way the decisions they've made, and you know, so that's what I'm having a hard time balancing with this right now. I understand and agree with the underlying premise, but some of the fine tuning that that impacts our communities really needs to be discussed as well.
This is Commissioner Mark McCormick from the ACLU of Kansas. Chief Ramsey, is there a particular phrasing that you could point out for us?
Mark, you know, it's more on the lines of, you know, if we have someone that has, you know, been involved with reckless driving on multiple occasions, you know, they've hurt someone or they've been involved in a crash and they didn't have insurance and someone now has to absorb those costs. Those are the considerations that, you know, with broad recommendations aren't taken into account. And maybe that's what we're trying to do here, is just make broad recommendations. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't address that this is a complex issue and there's, you know, there's other considerations that need to be taken into account. Does that make sense? And I'm not trying to be a contrarian. I'm trying to think of the unintended consequences too.
Yeah, and if I may, again, this is Kate Davis with the Governor's Office. This is a topic that's been discussed again by these other commissions. Part of what's happening, the way this recommendation is framed, is to kind of shortcut so that this commission doesn't have to dive deeply into this and say, other folks have studied it and we affirm their recommendations. That may not be the will of this commission. And so we may want to get a little deeper into this. I will say, Chief Ramsey, I know in the conversations I've heard and been a part of, a lot of this kind of talking about these fines and fees and the reasons people are suspended has really focused on people who do not have a charge that has to do with dangerous driving, and is focused on people who their initial infraction was something not related to being a danger on the road, and their suspension is just as a result of not being able to pay fines and fees. That being said, that's not in this language that's right here. So you're making a really good flag and a good point. So I think the kind of question to the commission is, do we want to do a deeper dive on this topic? Or do we want to kind of take that the work that's been done by the other commission and just reference it in an affirming way?
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I wonder if we could actually combine those two pieces just a bit and affirm the work of the other commission while emphasizing that our focus is around those fines and fees and not underlying, and that we are focused here not on potential dangerous drivers or reckless drivers, but those folks who cannot drive because of fines and fees. And so is there a way that we can, I mean, I think that most of this language focuses on the financial aspect, but if we could emphasize that our commission is particularly interested in the work that the previous commission has done that focuses on access to driving for everyone in our community, regardless of ability to pay fines and fees.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. You know, I do wonder if, not knowing context or who was on the past commissions necessarily, I wonder about, as was mentioned with Judge Centino asking, what are we changing something to? And when we say, hey, another commission did it and we're acknowledging it, I wonder if for this group, since we do have one additional meeting and we've pulled very little, is this an area of opportunity? One to determine added language, or one to determine if even more things need to be added to this particular area. I'd be interested in hearing what other commissions think in regards to making sure whatever we put in, it is the voice of the folks on this screen primarily. Mr. McCormick, do you have a thought on that?
Sort of. I think the spirit of what we're after, and this is for Chief Ramsey as well. My thoughts on this had more to do with the kind of two-tier criminal justice system that we find ourselves in from time to time, where if you have means and you're pulled over for reckless driving, you're going to be able to maintain your license and keep working. If you're a person operating in the margins, if you're a working class person, losing your license could lead to these cascading effects that we're trying to avoid with this particular bullet point. I think as long as we indicate the spirit of the change that we're after, that may be sufficient, but I don't want to speak for everyone else.
This is co-chair Dr. Portillo. I wonder if, Kate, you would be able to circulate the report that we're basing this off of this week, and we can bring this up for a vote again on the 19th, so that we can all have a chance to read the report that this is based on, and make sure that we have a chance to think through some of the ideas that Commissioner McCormick is putting in to see if there's additional language that we need to add. Because I do think that this is something that the access piece is something that is vital to the core mission of our commission. And so I don't want us to move past a vote on this, but I do think if we have a bit more information and a bit more time to process that information, we can vote quickly next week.
And this is co-chair Dr. Anderson, which I agree completely. I think we talked about licenses in one listening session, and how Topeka created a different license, and it's the only place that's done that. So I agree completely. I would also propose that some suggested language, because it can take a minute to wordsmith something in this space, and we have such a short period of time. The suggested language of Commissioner McCormick and Commissioner Ramsey together prior to the next meeting could perhaps play with that language a little bit, so that we glance at the report, get a little bit more knowledge, but the spirit of it is here. It's just tweaking it slightly. If that would be okay for both of you gentlemen, that would be great. Thank you.
This is co-chair Dr. Portillo. So I'll move to that second bullet point under the justice system, which is adopt recommendations from the pretrial justice reform task force related to bail, bond, and other pretrial justice issues. So this is a report that was sent to the entire commission, and we did also have a learning session with Chief Judge Carol Berger. And so we've all had a chance to review that particular report. I'll open this bullet point up to additional discussion.
You know, this is Judge Centeno in Sedgwick County. I do recall attending the listening session with Chief Justice Arnold, but I also remember attending the public defender listening sessions, two of them. And I thought that one of the public defenders had suggested that we encourage or advocate that when bond is set by a judge, that a defense attorney also be present, because there is certainly a state attorney who's present. And I haven't seen that in this report. So I'm wondering if that's something that we could add in this particular section.
So that this is co-chair Dr. Portillo again. So that would mean an additional bullet point saying, or a sub bullet point saying, in addition to what's in the pretrial report, we suggest that a defense attorney be present when bond is set.
Exactly. I think that is completely beneficial. Essentially what happens is that you only hear from the district attorney's office, and then the judge is expected to make a bond based upon the information that is just given by that side of litigation.
So So does the commission feel, this is Shannon Portillo, co-chair, does the commission feel comfortable accepting these 2 bullet points? Fantastic. We will move these forward to the final report and move on to our final bullet point in our yellow section, which is funding. We have 3 bullet points under our funding section. The first reads, local law enforcement agencies should pursue available grant funding from local, state, and federal sources to support reform and improvement efforts. The second, the Governor's Grant Office should add 1 FTE to assist local law enforcement agencies in identifying and applying for applicable grants to support reform and improvement efforts. The third, local law enforcement agencies, especially smaller agencies, should explore options for partnership with other agencies to assist in implementation of reform and improvement efforts. And we will open up the funding discussion.
This is Ernesto De La Rosa, Dodge City. In the first bullet point, I'm wondering if the state should make funding available, but I have no question or doubt that agencies would pursue funding. But I wonder if there's a lack of funding available.
So this is co-chair Shannon Portillo. Having moved from the Commonwealth of Virginia back to my home state of Kansas, I've been really surprised at kind of the lack of participation in some federal grants in our local criminal justice system. There's quite a bit of federal money out there for a number of these reforms. So I think a lot of this isn't necessarily focused at the state level, though some of it's passed through money that the Governor's Grants Office would manage, but there are a lot of federal grants that are available to local law enforcement agencies that I think many local law enforcement agencies would be really competitive for if they kind of had the support to do some of that grant writing. So Ernesto, I hear what you're saying when it comes to potential support, but I think we were focused from the support level at looking at an FTE to help write towards some of these grant applications, since I think a lot of that funding is actually coming from the federal level.
Thanks for the clarification.
So any additional conversation, Commissioner Nave?
Yeah, this is John Nave, Kansas FLCIO. You know, when we talk about the federal grants and the fund, you know, applying for those, I think there was said earlier in some discussion in the past that, you know, mainly the big agencies, they know they go after those grants and funding, but what again, what about those smaller agencies that tend to be left out? How do we, I mean, we can't say you got to apply for this, but how do we get them to apply for that? Because it does take work and it takes some skills in putting these things together. So I don't know, do they offer a grant writing in law enforcement?
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. So this, I think that you're exactly right. It's the support for applications that is one of the biggest challenges for some of our smaller agencies throughout the state. And so that is why we have that second bullet point that focuses on 1 full FTE in the Governor's Grants Office to work with agencies on some of their applications. And then in that third bullet point, we do encourage some smaller agencies to work with larger agencies. For many of these grants, they can be kind of interjurisdiction collaboration grants. So if you have larger agencies that are partnering with smaller agencies, it may be a way for smaller agencies to get some exposure to some of that. Though I will say that some of these smaller agencies would be very competitive on their own. They just need some of those kind of support for that grant writing. This is also an opportunity from a training perspective for us to work with KLETC on grant writing and managing funded resources. And we may want to add a fourth bullet point here that says we recommend that KLETC develop and promote grant writing and grant management as an area of increased training for local agencies.
Yes, that would work great. That's great. That gives them at the open end of training as they go through it, that's there for them.
And this is Shannon Portillo, co-chair. I do just want to note that Commissioner Jordan also put in the chat that it's worth noting that agencies should work with philanthropy and community partners for support. And I do think that we note local, state, and federal sources we may want to add in here, foundations and philanthropic sources as well in that first bullet point. Oh, and Kate already has it in there. Thank you. Any additional conversation? Are we seeing consensus for our funding section? Okay, we will move that to the final report. So that concludes all of the areas that we had in our yellow section. I would just like us to go over our blue section and see if there are any we would like to move forward on this evening, or ensure that we have folks associated with writing some specifics for anything left in the blue areas. So school resource officers, we've had 2 really informative learning sessions since our last meeting, one with national expert Professor Aaron Kupchak around all of the evidence and research around school resource officers. We also had a session around juvenile justice on Monday, and Dr. Anderson is organizing another session for this coming Monday. So we will look at school resource officers in our final meeting on the 19th. And we will look at some, if any commissioners would like to suggest specific language, please make sure you send that to Kate before the 19th so we can have discussion around specific language in our next meeting. Recruitment, retention, and promotion. We've had some discussions around a chief diversity officer, and I think the biggest piece for that was that we needed some very specific language on what that would look like and where that might be housed. So we had some commissioners who had volunteered to provide some additional language. If there's language that we should consider today, please let us know. If not, please be sure to email Kate before our next meeting so that we have very specific language to consider on the 19th. And then officer certification and standards. Create a statewide list of officers who have been fired or for use of force complaints. Is this one that we have space to have additional conversation this afternoon? Since we did cover some of this in our discussion around hiring and retention. Do we see this as a completely separate conversation? Should we mirror the language that we had in our above section around hiring and retention? Commissioner Ramsey, it does look like you were listed here as one of the potential commissioners to have further conversation here.
I think it would be good for Mark McCormick and I to talk and then report back.
Sounds good. So we'll look forward to your additional language by the 19th or before the 19th.
I object to Chief Ramsey volunteering me for yet another task.
I would like to note that you and Chief Ramsey have taken on the bulk of the tasks from this particular meeting.
Hey, I bought lunch last time, Mark.
Okay. We had some accountability bullet points in our yellow section, but we have some additional accountability bullet points here. Some were based off of our learning session with the FOP, which concluded last night. The first is further research into the FOP and their role in contract negotiations and effects on transparency. We learned in our learning session last night that it really varies by jurisdiction in our state, and that there are a number of jurisdictions where FOP does not participate in contract negotiations, though there are certainly some jurisdictions where they do. I think that the idea of contract negotiations around police and local communities is a much bigger topic than considered in just this one bullet point. How would the commission like to move forward with this bullet point at this time?
This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. Since it does mention learning session, I'd be interested in perhaps others to hear the learning session piece, which is the next thing that we're going into. I think several of these may have learning sessions attached to them, so that whatever languages presented, we all are learning, if we didn't go to that session, what things might also have come up.
Great, this is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. So why don't we start with that learning session with the FOP that happened last night. So for those of you in attendance, would you share out on a bit of how that went?
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. I think it was pretty good. It was informative. It gave us some information concerning the state Fraternal Order of Police and what they do versus the local and the national. What they did explain is that ultimately the local FOP lodges have their own ability to do kind of as they want, as long as they line up with the national. And so there's no directive, if you will, or control that the state has over the locals. That there are multiple agencies. I know that last night their attorney spoke of Johnson County specifically, who has their own, what many of those agencies do not have unions that negotiate their contracts, whereas in Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas, and I believe in Wichita, which is Sedgwick County, they do have negotiating unions concerning the different contracts with the city and how it differs from agency to agency. We did talk about several things, mainly a couple of things that stuck in my mind was the officer involved shootings, investigations. They're of the mindset and agree with the best practices, which is that there should be an outside agency that comes in. I think for Wichita and for many other agencies in the state, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation comes in for those investigations, specifically the ones that are that result in death and others. I think Wichita went as far as saying anything involving an officer, they bring in someone else, whether it's the KBI or Sheriff's Department or someone else. So that's a good thing. They are for that. And I know that there is no uniformity here in the state concerning that, as Wyandotte County was not one of the agencies that brought in independent investigations until recent. But the last year we have brought in Topeka to do those investigations. And so that was a good thing to hear. They did not really give us an answer in concern of where they stand concerning a list of folks who have been substantiated in violating of maybe excessive force or any general orders or things of that sort. They kind of fell back onto that it depends on the situation. And so I think that's something that can still be up for conversation, but those are just a couple of the takeaways that I took.
So Brandon Davies, University of Kansas. One thing that stuck out to me was that, as you were saying, that those different FOPs have a lot of autonomy and there's no real standardization across the state. Is that I brought up the fact that there was a man in Lawrence who had been had his skateboarding and had his shoulder broken, arm broken, tooth chipped, and with multiple bruises and lacerations from his encounter with a police officer from skateboarding on the sidewalk. And the case has just been dropped because the officer that did that to him has been known to perjure himself or had perjured himself in the past. And so I asked them, how was it that that type of officer could still have a badge? And they didn't really have a good answer because they don't cover Lawrence, or to a certain extent, they don't have a FOP in Lawrence or something like that. I don't know. And so it made me think that maybe instead of relying on the FOP and like labor to fire these individuals, that maybe there should be a standard revocation of your certificate for certain offenses. Like, so if you perjure yourself, that's just an automatic, your ability to be a licensed sworn officer in Kansas is gone. And so something like that way you don't have to worry about the different agencies having different policies for different things. There's across the board offenses that are automatic revocations of your license. And that could be something that we leave up to the police department, Caltech, or whoever to decide, what those just things we things we will not tolerate type of offenses, and that gets us around the labor aspect, because if you don't have a license, you can't be a law enforcement officer. That's what I got from. I'm Brandon Davis, University of Kansas.
This is Shannon Portillo, co-chair. I also attended the FOP session, and I echo a lot of what Commissioner Dupree and Commissioner Davis have laid out, that there is quite a variety in how the FOP approaches labor negotiations across the state. And so I wonder if we might want to have different or further discussion over the course of this week around any language. I think a lot of what Dr. Davis has brought up is actually covered by CPOST, and so not necessarily something that would be a part of labor negotiations. So to see if we can spend this week seeing if we want to update this bullet point or make any changes. I do just want to point out that it's now 4:15 and we are meant to transition to our second topic on the agenda for this evening. And our second topic is really focused on that idea of how we want to communicate and roll out the findings from our final report.
And this is co-chair Dr. Anderson. Before we transition to that 4:15, as we go through that, are we going to circle back to the learning session reports? I know many went to many learning sessions in the last week, and we'll want to hear out on those, because this week and next week will be the last time. So is it the will of the commission to go ahead and transition to learning session reports, or to transition to the rollout at this time to stay within our time frame? What do you think, Dr. Portillo?
Why don't we finish discussions of the learning session before we transition to rollout? So we had a number of additional learning sessions this week, including the juvenile justice learning session and a learning session on SROs. And I believe there was a fourth learning session.
This is co-chair Dr. Anderson. Ms. Davis, can you pull up the learning sessions that we went to? So for those that are on the phone or listening remotely, we are reminded of all of those. I know that Chief Ramsey also had a learning session. Appleseed had a learning session. So as we pull that list up.
Sorry, this is Kate Davis from the governor's office. We have had 4 learning sessions since the last commission meeting. One was Dr. Kupchik presenting on academic research around SROs. The second was juvenile justice and racial disparities, which was a joint presentation by Kansas Appleseed and members of the Kansas Advisory Group on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The third was juvenile officers, coordinated by Chief Ramsey with some folks who work as officers in educational settings and had experiences with that. And then the fourth was the Fraternal Order of Police session that happened last night.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. So for those that attended any or all of those learning sessions that would like to report out, now would be a great time for that. And then we'll just transition right on to the rollout of this report.
Well, I was in, this is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney, and I was in the academic listening session for SROs, but I also was in the SRO listening session with Chief Ramsey. And you heard a huge differentiation of what people thought concerning having SROs in the schools. And so I would really love to hear the different thought processes. I know Dr. Anderson, not to call you out, but I'm calling you out. You had some thoughts concerning SROs and your experience. I would love to kind of have that dialogue, as well as Dr. Davis, because in one note it's good to have, but then I also heard the other side of it was that I think one guy, the professor, said that you're more prone to have SROs in predominantly white schools. However, SROs are more prone to arrest African Americans in the schools. And so just the way that they see students, one being victims and they have to protect versus one being criminals. And so I think that those are some of the things that I got, and those are some things that I would love to do.
And follow to your comment directed to me, this is Commissioner Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. The Monday session that will be held as well on this topic will be an SRO who is now a principal. Then there'll be an international presenter who is also an adjunct medical professor at Case Western, who addresses SROs and does training. And then a couple of principals who have implemented, added social workers, restorative justice, who also have SROs. So you'll get a various perspectives as well in that Monday session. I will share, at least, and I went to all but the FOP learning sessions. In answer to your question, at least on the feedback and thought, one of the items as a takeaway for me, one, listening to the SROs from Chief Ramsey, which thank you for that, as well as listening to the researcher earlier in the week, was looking at the links of the reports that were sent for research. There is not a lot of research on this particular topic. However, there is some, and I liken it to history. It depends on who's telling the history in terms of what history is told. And so since then, I pulled several articles, and so I will send to, and have sent some to Ms. Davis, sharing other perspectives about SROs, just good empirical evidence. But additionally, ESSA requires, every Student Succeeds Act requires that schools report the percentage of police and arrests in schools. And so on Monday, the advocate for the juvenile crime bill that Dr. Davis, you asked about not arresting students for minor offenses, that actually can be done and should be done. And districts could and should have a memorandum of understanding not to arrest students. But that's not enacted in the way that it could be. But the attorney and chief that has championed that, they will also be on Monday to talk about that. But the percentage of schools that actually have SROs in the United States, or that have police in their schools, it's about 28%. And Kansas is a little less than that. But what I did do is pull the number of arrests overall. And it's just interesting looking at the data, because as we talk about breaking the school to prison pipeline, the number of arrests from SROs in schools, at least if I just focus on Kansas, it's less than 1% are referred for arrest compared to the overall arrests of whether they're African-American students or otherwise. And the more you disaggregate that data, and that's just based on Office of Civil Rights data, the more you disaggregate that data and look at districts that have students that are disproportionately represented in jail or in juvenile who don't have SROs, I would just encourage that we examine what works in breaking the school to prison pipeline. And I would call it a cradle to prison pipeline, actually, but what works in doing that and having some things based on empirical evidence in that regard. So that's the purpose of the Monday session. And I noted that I certainly support, if used right and well, and using a lot of social work piece, which is one of the articles that I pulled, that SROs can be quite beneficial.
This is Commissioner Mark McCormick. I did not attend that session, but I would say that if we're in a an atmosphere of scarcity in terms of resources. I would almost always choose a school psychologist over having a SRO. And like Co-Chair Anderson, would be really interested in making sure that we are severing that pipeline of whether it's from the cradle or from the school or wherever. And I just think that school psychologists could be a lot more helpful in those situations. But that's just my thought.
This is Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. And I sat through the SRO things, and just to, school to prison pipeline, there is no school to prison pipeline without SROs in schools. It did not exist before we put cops in schools. You can't arrest kids if there's no cops in schools. But that is not to say that every SRO is a bad person, right? So when you're talking about these anecdotes, like we talked to the two great SROs that Chief Ramsey has, that are doing these amazing things with these kids, that are doing these amazing things, in their communities. I mean, that is amazing work. However, that is not what the generalized data is telling us about having police in schools. So aside from even arresting kids, it's also an effect on the environment, on the school climate and things like that. And I would say that, it's not about saying we're going to take every last SRO out of a school, right? With the two gentlemen we talked to from Chief Ramsey's department, those are great. I mean, I wouldn't want to remove those guys from what they were doing. They're doing really good work, right? So I think we just have to think about alternatives, like the school psychologists, like alternatives, but think outside the box alternatives, because we haven't always had these individuals in schools. And so we're talking about not even that long ago. Like I graduated in '99, we didn't have police in schools, so in my school. And so what I'm saying is that, the individuals that some individuals that are SROs are amazing people, but generally speaking, we're talking about increases in arrests for juveniles, boys and girls. We're talking about, in the paper, watching people arrest 6-year-old children, right? And we're not saying that your SRO is doing it, whatever school or whatever department. We're saying that if you have police in school, this is the possibility, because police have a certain toolkit, and that toolkit is not social work, right? That toolkit is not psychology. That toolkit is not, social services, right? They have a certain toolkit, and that toolkit does not involve, these other types of elements that children may need. And I'm saying that as a social worker, as someone with MSW, as someone who used to work with therapeutic foster care children, as someone that was president of the State Association of Social Workers for the state of Alabama, who was a foster care worker who worked with therapeutic foster care kids who were in and out of group homes, Mount Meg, which is a child psychiatric facility, who was in and out of Department of Youth Services, which is a child prison when it comes to the state of Alabama, that, it is vital that children have all these opportunities that they have that we give Kansas children the best opportunities they have. And that may not mean increasing the likelihood, increasing, police in schools, right? They may not mean, being as or growing the population of police that are in schools. There are other things we can do, I believe, that can benefit children, especially children in marginalized groups, right? So we're talking about Black and white, Black, poor, Native kids. And then on top of that, you have kids who are come from group homes, foster homes, so the marginalized of the marginalized. And they're going to schools, and we know that schools disproportionately punish Black and brown kids and Native kids. And so you're gonna disproportionately punish those kids. And then in that group, you have an even more marginalized group, which are the kids that are on social services, who are even more likely to have contact with authority figures, including SROs. So you kind of a double down even on those children. And so again, it is totally, we don't expect that all SROs are bad people, right? But those are anecdotes. And the idea that it's going to be beneficial for every school system, I think is something we need to look at, because I don't think it's beneficial for every school system, especially if your school system doesn't have the police that Gordon Ramsey has, right? And so that's a different ball game, right? Because we talked to those two officers, passionate, knew what they were doing. Like, if you like, I guess everybody would like to have those pair working in their schools, but however, everybody doesn't have that kind of those kind of officers.
This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair, and not to belabor the point, since Monday we will have that added listening session. And there's, I agree very much, Dr. Davis and Commissioner McCormick, with the comments of needing as many resources, I believe, as it relates to school psychologists and school social work. However, given that over 70% of the schools in Kansas do not have SROs, and we clearly have a school to prison pipeline or cradle to prison pipeline, we certainly have communities with no SROs, with a high number of overrepresented African-American men in particular, and Hispanic and Latino individuals. I think it'd be a missed opportunity if we don't examine systems and mindsets, and no matter who's in front of children, a psychologist, a social worker, or an SRO, that there is a level of training and mindset and systems that we encourage through this commission that are in place, no matter who the individuals are. One of the items that I will just point out, and there is a lot of empirical evidence that says the opposite of not having SROs in school, which is why some of those reports that are firewalled I've sent to Ms. Davis, and some will be shared on Monday. But the only other item that I'll say to that point is in the 90s, prior to the police officers, which again in the US, they're only 29% in schools, so why then do we have this overrepresentation? It's not just SROs that are the issue. The zero tolerance policies are an issue. The high expulsion and discipline rates, suspending students out of school instead of keeping them in school. Those are issues that I think we have this opportunity. And if we didn't have that, and SROs came after that actually, in terms of that early 90s zero tolerance policies. But if we didn't have that, we'd be breaking a lot of systems. But we have 70% of the schools districts in Kansas that don't have SROs. So I think it is behooves us to create some systems, mindsets, and just strategies. So I look forward to exploring those other strategies that we know do actually work to break that pipeline.
Vernon Davis, University of Kansas. And I do agree. Like, one of the things I suggested in the last SRO meeting is that there is training optional for SROs, but there's no mandatory training for SROs. So in the state of Kansas, like what Chief Ramsey's guys were saying is that they go to a training, but that's because Wichita can afford to send them to a training. There's also the other guy from Western Kansas said that there's a training available, but that training is not mandated. And so having a standardized mandated training, so if you're going to be an SRO, you have to have this mandated training, I think will go a long way too. To having some standardization, and also some standardization of best practices when it comes to being an SRO. And I think that the training agency could do that in conjunction with KU, because we do have a school of social welfare.
This is Shannon Portillo, co-chair. So there were two other learning sessions, or there was one other learning session, the juvenile justice learning session with Kansas Appleseed. I know a number of us were there as well on Monday. Would we like to have a quick discussion around that session before moving on to our discussion of the report rollout?
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney, and I was at that session as well. It was informative. The Appleseed attorney, as well as the other folks who were there, forgive me for going blank on their names, they gave us a lot of information concerning the things that our juvenile statutes are saying and how it can be better. Likewise, making sure that we focus on rehabilitation concerning our children and giving them resources. There was a lot of conversation on the juvenile criminal justice system compared to DCF, and what resources DCF has to offer. And there's a lot of data that they're looking in and looking into and trying to figure out what's the best way to serve our young people and our kiddos here. One of the things that I walked away thinking about was, are there some laws that we have and some crimes that we have for juveniles that are adult crimes, right? But that may want to look at to see if they should be technically considered crimes for our children. And I think that that's something that may come up in another conversation, but it kind of goes in line with how we are looking at our young adults or our children. Are we looking at focusing in on punishment, or are we looking in at trying to give them the opportunity to be rehabilitated? Example of that I thought about after getting off of that call was, if I hit someone as an adult and I'm not at school, I'm going to be charged with battery. Depending on how much damage I do, it may be aggravated battery. Well, if I'm a child and I'm at school and I have a fight, I'm still charged. That child now is charged with the same crime of battery and or potentially aggravated battery. And whereas the question was in my mind, should that be a crime as it would be to the adult, or should it be something that a teacher and administrators can deal with inside there without that student walking away with a felony on their record, as well as being suspended from school? So those are all conversations that I took away with that listening session.
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. I was at that listening session as well, and Appleseed shared their most recent report around the juvenile justice system with us, and we can make sure that that's circulated to the entire commission. They had some specific recommendations, and so we might consider those specific recommendations, and if there's anything that we would like to add to our report next week. So we can circulate the recommendations that they laid out and see if there's anything additional that we would like to put in. Since we've had a chance to discuss all 4 of our learning sessions over the past 2 weeks, I would like for us to now move on to our discussion of how we might roll out our report. So as we all know, we'll finalize our report next week on the 19th. We'll finalize our recommendations. We'll have a full draft of that report with all of the recommendations written out on that following week, which is Thanksgiving week. But then this report is due to the governor's office on December 1st. Once it is sent out to the governor's office, there are 3 main things that we really want to focus on when it comes to how we roll this report out. The first is really a communications plan, and how do we want to organize ourselves as a commission to put forward this report, not just to the governor's office, but to various stakeholders. So the second area that we'd like to spend a bit of time discussing today is, who do we see as the stakeholders for this report, and who do we want to make sure we have conversations with once our report is finalized, and how do we want to share that out? And then the third is really the on the ground work, and so how we might write op-eds or talk with the folks in our areas about this report. So are there other ways that we want to share this report other than stakeholder meetings when we think about different forms of communication? Op-eds, interviews, that sort of thing. So I'd like to open it up kind of in those 3 areas. What should a plan for distribution look like? Who are our stakeholders for this report? And who might be interested in some of that kind of other forms of communication work? So we'll start with the plan. What would we like that to look like as a commission? Or do we have anyone who might want to volunteer in putting something together for us?
This is Commissioner McCormick from the ACLU of Kansas. A section of this, of what you're talking about, is pretty much what I do for a living. In 2018, we sent Cora requests to all 105 county clerks who are election officials. We surveyed them, and then we compiled the report into a 40-page booklet. And then I handled the rollout. So there are technical aspects of this that I'm familiar with. I like your idea of starting with our stakeholders and kind of listing them. I would also recommend that for some of the higher level stuff, we speak in as few voices as possible, maybe just our co-chairs. And because we come from different parts of the state or have connections in different parts of the state, leave open the possibility that, if Gordon wanted to write something for the Wichita Eagle, he could do that. If Commissioner Nave wanted to write something for the Capital Journal, he could do that. But for the most part, I kind of like your idea of beginning with the stakeholders, and then with some of the technical aspects of it, I would be willing to work on that with whomever would want to join me.
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo again. Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. We were really hoping, given your professional background in this area, that you might be willing to volunteer. I know that I think if we were to tally all of the volunteers and voluntold that we've had during this particular session, you're outpacing all of us, but I appreciate you being willing to take this one on, given your professional expertise in this area.
Well, I would like to nominate Chief Ramsey to work with me on that.
Well, I think you've already slated him for an op-ed in the Wichita Eagle, so I'm sure that he'll have drafts ready to circulate to the commission soon.
This is David Jordan with the United Methodist Health Ministry Fund. I'm happy to help work with Mark on thinking through some of the stakeholders and some of the legislative outreach, if that's helpful.
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. It would be fantastic if you and Mark could work together on a communications plan, and you can really help us with that legislative piece, given your background in that, Mr. Jordan. I appreciate it. And so I'm hoping what we can do is really think about how the two of you brainstorm a plan for us that maybe can give some guidance to the rest of the commission. If there's, I don't know, a few bullet points or a quick kind of overview of what the rest of the commissioners need to know. I heard the speak in as few voices as possible, but make sure we're reaching out in our local communities, just something where we can potentially wrap our heads around what that might look like. And maybe we can discuss, if you two have a chance to discuss that before next week, we can discuss that as a full commission next week when it comes to kind of an overarching plan or some guidelines to lay out for ourselves.
This is Commissioner McCormick again. The only question that I would have, and this is something that I did with our elections report, I allowed a couple of news outlets to have a copy of the report in advance on an embargoed basis. And just embargo is a newspaper term where you allow a reporter access to some information with an expiration date for them to be able to report it. And sometimes it really works to your advantage. If you give them an embargoed copy, they can do a deeper dive on it. If we make some people available to them to do the interviews, what ends up happening is you get much better coverage, and you get a much better ride, meaning you'll probably end up on the front page above the fold or leading a newscast, as opposed to handing a large document to a reporter who's on deadline and has to read it quickly and ends up not really giving you the kind of story and insight that you were looking for. So my question would be, would we have the ability to offer on an embargoed basis the report to a limited number of media organizations?
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. I think it really depends on where we're at next week at the conclusion of our meeting next week, because we don't want a draft to go out that isn't a full and complete draft, and we still have some key considerations that we need to talk through as a commission. But that can certainly be a point of conversation next week.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. It is wonderful to have heard from Commissioner McCormick and Commissioner Jordan. There was a third person we thought would volunteer, so we don't have to voluntold in regards to the community. There you go. All right, Commissioner Nay, we're waiting on you. We were going to voluntold you if you didn't speak up. That's beautiful that that happened naturally. That's great. I feel like you all are part of my family, that we already know who's going to jump on in there. Well, we thank you three for doing that. And then the next commission meeting, if you could be prepared to report out on the plan and the groups. Ms. Davis will be the one that can guide us on the embargoed or not in terms of what we can and can't share in advance, as she has given great guidance in that regard. In fact, both Commissioner Portillo and I will be speaking to the legislative body, and we can't share recommendations there. We will be sharing just topics and timeline. So Ms. Davis, if we can rely on you to continue to guide in that regard, that would be most appreciated.
Dr. Anderson, this is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney, and I was going to say to the, I'm going to call them the marketing team, if you guys would be so ever kind to also throw in a plan for social media and how we as commissioners can partake in the spreading of this information. And so I just want to make sure that you put something together for the folks who just know how to click a button, and that's about all we can offer. Thank you.
This is Co-Chair Portillo. I appreciate that focus on all of the types of media, social media, and thinking about how we might get this out broadly. Do we want to spend a bit of time so we can get some input from the rest of the commission before we send Commissioners Nave, McCormick, and Jordan off to brainstorm a plan for us around stakeholders and who we see kind of broadly as our stakeholders for this particular report?
This is Ernesto De La Rosa, City of Dodge City. Just a comment or suggestion as part of that marketing plan is to include Spanish reporting to some extent, and I'll be happy to help with translation or any of that work.
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. Thank you, Ernesto. We appreciate that. Any additional? Oh, go ahead.
Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. I know that some of the other commissions and task force who have released some of their completed work, some of those were sent out to myself and others. And so I think that if you all can look at the different commissions that are already in place, the pretrial task force, the criminal justice reform task force, and things of that sort, and potentially utilizing the chairs of those commissions as well as many of the topics that we covered likewise overlapped with their topics as well.
This is Co-Chair Portillo, so it sounds like we have a solid plan for how we're going to approach our rollout. I'll turn it over to Co-Chair Dr. Anderson, see what else we have to conclude our meeting this afternoon.
This is Commissioner Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. I am excited that it is 4:48 and we are wrapping up a very robust agenda. We weren't sure if we were going to get through all of those items. As our next steps in our outreach plan, as has been stated, the very next meeting, we have a few items that are still in blue that we're going to come back to. We know that both Chief Ramsey and Commissioner McCormick will be proposing some language on 2 or 3 of those bullets and preparing that, and the marketing team will be coming back with a plan regarding that. Lastly, the final learning session will be on Monday. And on that learning session, again, only 6 commissioners can attend that. So if you're interested, please do let Ms. Davis know following this. And those are all the items I think that are next steps. And I'll turn it over to Commissioner Nave.
Yes, this is John Nave, Kansas AFL-CIO. I wanted to bring something up that I've been meaning to, Dr. Anderson, I think we mentioned it early at the start of the session, and I don't know if one of the other commissioners had mentioned it. There was a testing program that teachers had to take to become a teacher. I don't know, they're in certain districts throughout the state or here in 501, but that was a good indication whether they're going to, that qualifies or gives them that certification that they can get hired if they go through this testing program. And it sounded to me that I really like that idea. If there is a program that they get, or there's a test that they take, and once they complete the test and that it informs them that they will make a great teacher or they will not make a great teacher. Can you recall that? We had some discussion about it. And I didn't want to, and I had it written down on some paper and I found it, and I just wanted to bring that to the fold and get some thoughts from others or from you, Dr. Anderson.
And Commissioner Nave, I don't know that this is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. I don't know that I recall that. However, if this is related to policing and ensuring that they have some level of testing similar to teachers, and there are several assessments for teachers. I know we give our teachers a screener that helps us know if this is someone that is predicted to be someone of a high performer in the teacher area. Gallup from Gallup Polls has one. The Haberman is an urban one that Kansas City Public Schools used to use. So there are certainly screeners out there. So if this is related to ensuring police officers have some level of screener, perhaps that's this piece. If it's related to education overall, I would encourage that we maybe talk offline on that, since this commission will be in place next year as well, talking about education, mental health, and a variety of other matters. Does that help, sir?
Yes, that'll be fine.
Co-Chair Anderson, this is Commissioner McCormick. I brought that up. I had mentioned at a previous meeting that years ago, I had custody of a nephew of mine. He was 6 or 7, and he was going to an Edison program school, a private school. And the principal there told me about an instrument that they use called the Urban Teacher Perceiver Test that would measure a person's ability to teach in an urban environment. And if the person who wanted to work at the Edison school in the Edison project failed the perceiver, they could not even apply for the job. So Commissioner Nave, I had mentioned that previously.
And with that perceiver is called the Haberman. That's the very first one that I mentioned. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And for the purpose of the group, since it's coming up in this space, this is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. I will ask Ms. Davis, I just looked up the link, but rather than putting it in the chat for the purpose of all commissioners, I will ask Ms. Davis to include that. The Haberman is specifically for urban districts. So most administrators, at least when I was chief academic in Kansas City Public Schools, all of our administrators received that training as well. And it gives a prediction. And then the other ones that I mentioned, the Talent Ed and Gallup for Gallup Poll also do that as well. So I'll send her that link for future conversation. I believe that's everything on our list. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Portillo, to close it on out.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I was just going to say, it sounds like we have a great list of activities for the next week. So please check your email regularly and look for those updates on various reports that are being sent to you. And if you have an assignment for language, please get that to us as soon as possible so we can make sure that we circulate that to all commissioners by next Wednesday. And then we'll have our final commission meeting 1 week from our final commission meeting before the report is done. We're going through 2022. But our final commission meeting before our first report is due next week on the 19th. So Thank you all for an incredibly productive meeting this afternoon and looking forward to seeing you next week.